So the point of this meeting is to, as we've worked through the EMS Compact, still out there known a lot as Replica, although that we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's actually the wrong way to refer to it, unless you are a state that is working on the legislation. So for us, it's the EMS Compact, also known as the Interstate EMS Compact, Personnel Practice Compact. There's about 1,000 different ways to say the same thing out there, but it doesn't fit me if you say replica. I know what you're talking about, and because that was the first word we ever heard associated with it, I'm sure that will continue to perpetuity. But anyway, it bugs Scott, so feel free to keep throwing that at him. So it's been around for a little while now in Wyoming. There are a few new states. Here in a little bit, we'll talk about what those states are, because that matters. But so this whole meeting came to be because several folks, not so much in state, but a lot of out of folk state, try to use replica in ways in which that it doesn't work. Right? Replica is a very specific tool in the toolbox. Where it is today, where it sits and what the capabilities are in it is very different than what was initially discussed. And Scott will have more insight into this, but he was one of the first ones in the country working on this way back in the day. I don't know exactly when. I'm going to say circa 2012-ish or something like that is when all of that conversation kicked off. And it started off to be a mechanism for wildland firefighters and similar situations like that to cross the borders without jumping through all the hoops that any of you that have experience trying to bring some of those folks on. You've certainly lived through that nightmare back before we had emergency licensing and things like that as an option. So all this started there, and now it is a little bit bigger than that. There's some other mechanisms on the forward-facing piece of the commission's website. It says that it's designed for short-term temporary allowances for EMS personnel to bring their scope of practice across a border to solve a problem. As we go through these rules, you'll see that it's actually a little bit bigger than that, and there's some other ways that Replica/EMS Compact allows us to, at the state, to bring people in, and you as an agency to bring people in, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a crisis or emergency. So that's where I'm going to start. Scott is going to really focus on the methods and the mechanisms that not just you, but your remote licensees, which we'll talk about that terminology in a minute, but that they'll use to actually engage this process and come into Wyoming via Replica/Compact. Now, what this is not, all right, this is not a way to bypass Wyoming licensing, okay? If you have personnel here, let's give an example of Jackson. Jackson hires 2 new paramedics, okay? And the reason why I'm giving you this example on the front end before we talk about the rules is because think about this example as we go through some of these details, and all of this will make more sense to you, right? So Mike Moyer up there hires 2 new paramedics. One of them lives in Jackson and the other lives in Idaho. All right, that's where they live, that's where they're from. Both of them hold Idaho EMS licenses, okay? Idaho being a replica state. The initial knee-jerk thought is, well, we can bring them in under replica and they don't have to get our background check and all that because they've already done it under Idaho. So when we talk through these rules and talk about home state and remote state and home agencies and agency authorizations to practice in a state, I want you to think about that scenario. And by the end of my little talk, we'll wrap this scenario up and Mike will clearly understand because only one of those people qualify under replica. And it's all about their address. Okay. So we'll talk through that. So let's get to it. So this is their rules, right? These are not our rules. This is the compact rules. This is the latest version that is in effect. All right. There is some changes to this and some new additions that are currently in public comment. I encourage you to go to their website if you want to take a look at those. As far as what we're talking about today, there's nothing substantive, that's going to change. It's really just cleaning up. This is their second draft, I believe, of their rules that we're looking at here, and the next one that's in progress will be their third. So just like anything, they're getting better and smarter as time goes along. And you got to remember that first set of rules was drafted in response to COVID, the pandemic, because this was not ready to go live yet. Technically, it wasn't legally allowed to go live when it did, except that like under all the state statutes. But the commission, I was part of that group. The commission got together and decided that, you know what, this kind of crisis we were dealing with in 2020, this is why this compact exists. So as a group, all of the states that have a legal stake in this 100% unanimously agreed to turn it on ahead of when really we should have under the fine letter of the law. But anyway, we did it and it worked, and Scott knows how many, but we brought a bunch of folks in under Replica to help deal with the pandemic. So anyway, let's get into this. So purpose and authority, skip all that. They have the authority to make rules. We gave it to them when we signed our statute, and every other state that has adopted the compact gave them the authority to sign rules, to assign rules. And also in our statute, we are bound, as you are bound, to the rules that the commission produces. So now, obviously, you have to follow our rules, but you and I also have to follow the compact rules now. So anything that's in here has the same force and effect of law as if the Office of EMS wrote rules and put them in effect here in the state. So adverse action, there's only a couple of definitions here I'm really going to hit. You guys can grab these off of their website. And actually, Scott, if you will pop them a link to this, or I can after I'm done talking while you're talking, because I know exactly where this is. It doesn't matter to me, but if you haven't done it, I'll come back and do it so you folks have access to this. The commission, these are the folks with the authority to write the rules. I am a member of that commission, so are every single other state that has adopted the compact. We all have an equal vote and equal membership in there. You can't have more than 2 voting members. So when there's 50 states on board, there will be 50 voting members of the commission. The commissioner, that is my title as it relates to the compact. I am the commissioner for the EMS Compact Commission, assigned from Wyoming. This is where Replica dies. All right. So this is the actual legal language where they said stop calling it Replica. From now on, because this definition exists, Replica is the AKA of compact. So if you really want to be proper, say compact. You don't even have to say EMS compact, which I think is a little weird, but compact means replica, but also you can use replica. We all know what you're talking about. So none of that matters. We'll talk about this more in detail. Coordinated database, Scott is going to wear that out for you. Scott is the coordinated database administrator for Wyoming. I am also an admin in there, but I have been through training to use it. I have never even logged into the site. If you've got a question about something database and you come to me, you are messing up. You need to go right to Scott. Okay. I will learn this. It's just far down my list of things that I need to prioritize right now. This is an important definition. It matches the Wyoming definition. EMS agency means an organization that is authorized by a state EMS authority to operate an ambulance service or non-transport service. So obviously we are the state EMS authority. Anyone who we say is an EMS agency. So that includes obviously those who transport patients on the ground, those who transport patients on the air, not on the air, in the air. If we ever do non-transport, if we ever do inter-facility specific transport agencies like non-emergency, the net cars, that sort of thing. If we ever do that, that may not literally be included in this because it all depends. Because Technically, that wouldn't be an ambulance service. Technically, we also do not get into that right now because there's not a need for it. But it's something we may get into someday. And if so, that agency may not, in fact, be an EMS agency under this compact. And the important note here is non-transport service. So Cheyenne Fire, the State Forestry Service, all those entities who have come to us and say, we want to be an EMS agency in some way, shape, or form, those are EMS agencies, which means they fit in the compact, so they can utilize the provisions of the compact to bring people in. License, I think that's pretty obvious. Member state, not every state has enacted this compact. Again, I wish I had taken 5 minutes and went and looked at that before I started this so I could give you the update. I think there's 23. Don't quote me on that. I'll put a better answer in chat when I'm done running my mouth. But I think there's 23 of them. Several of our neighbors are, and a couple of our neighbors are not. So that's important. This language, everything here, everything in our statute, it only matters if they're a member state, right? So Texas, people with Texas licenses can play. People with California licenses cannot, right? So you can't bring somebody in who lives in San Francisco because California is not a member state. And like for the biggest one that affects us is Montana. Montana, right above us, we have a lot of interaction with them. They are not a member state. So they don't qualify for the compact. All right. Non-member state, that one's relatively obvious, right? If there's 23 that are members, there's whatever 50 minus 23 is that are not. So those folks don't play. Privilege to practice. This is a tricky phrase, and we'll get into it a little deeper, but it means an individual's authority to do.
We lost your sound, Brandon.
Oh, sorry. You guys lost my audio. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so this will happen to me over and over again, and I don't know why. I will try to keep a better watch on it. For some reason, Zoom randomly mutes me, and it also mutes my audio, so I don't know why, but I will try to keep a watch on those little lights. But my bad. So I'll just redo what I'm saying here with privilege to practice, because I don't know how much you heard. Privilege to practice only matters to people who do not hold Wyoming licenses, but yet are working in Wyoming under the compact. Super important, all right? This does not, if you are a Wyoming licensee and you go to work in Texas, then privilege to practice is extended to you by Texas, okay? You don't hold a Texas license, you hold a Wyoming license. So when the term privilege to practice only means something under compact if you do not hold a license in the state you are working in, or the person working in this state does not hold a license to work here. Does that make sense? Maybe not. It'll be clearer here in a minute. Rule, as we talk about here, specifically talks about these things we are reading, all right? Not the state EMS rules that you guys all already are under. Rule here means we're talking about this thing, all right? And in case you don't know, rule and statutory law are the same thing, all right? They're a different process and they're created under a different mechanism, but they have the same effect of law. So you can be guilty of a crime by violating them. All of these other things, rule and law, just think of those as being the same, even though they're created a little differently, a lot differently, actually. Yeah, so state EMS authority, in this case, that is the Wyoming Office of EMS. Subject doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's the crux of the definition. So there's not a ton. I mean, I know that part was slow, but it's important to know the words that they use here and what they mean specifically here in case a conflict develops between what you know about our rules and what it says here, because both of them are in play equally at the same time. Okay. So what this says, this actually binds us under this law to do something. All right. A remote state shall recognize the privilege to practice of an individual who is licensed in another member state. All right. So if someone from Texas comes to Wyoming with a valid reason and authority to work in Wyoming, which all of this will lay out, we have to grant that. All right. As long as everything checks out with them, we can't tell them no. Okay. We'd have to have a really good reason to tell them no. And there's a few reasons in here. Hang on just a second. I'll be right back. Apologize, my dogs have lost their mind. Okay. Yeah, so this binds us to action, okay? As long as the home state complies with Section 3 of the compact, which is up in the statute, all right? Don't worry about that right now. Basically, it just means that all the things that they signed into law, the same things that we signed into law, as long as they do those things, right? That's fingerprint background checks, participate in the coordinated database, and have a mechanism for conducting investigations for violations of home state licensees, and reporting that to the coordinated database. This one right here is the kicker, all right? And it's the one that no one remembers, and everybody forgets about, but it is extremely important. Part B, the individual is performing EMS duties that are assigned by an EMS agency that is authorized in the remote state. Okay. What this means to Moyer's scenario I gave earlier, he's hired 2 paramedics, remember, one lives in Idaho and one lives in Wyoming, or in Jackson, Wyoming. So Mike represents Jackson Hole Fire Department, which is a licensed, authorized EMS agency in the state. Okay. Both of those people on this provision meet what this says. All right. The individual is performing EMS duties that are assigned by an EMS agency that is authorized in the remote state. So here, Idaho is the home state of his Idaho employee. Wyoming is the home state of his Jackson Hole residency employee. Does that make sense? Both of them are going to work for an EMS agency that is authorized in the remote state, except for his.
Lost you again.
I lost audio again. The employee that lives in Jackson, his home state is Wyoming, not Idaho, which means the agency that he is authorized to work in, Jackson Hole, is, my God, muting. It's going back to back. You know what? I'm going to call in. Stand by. If you got questions on what I just said, post them in the chat. I'm going to fix this problem here. Scott, I'm fixing to call in.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I do not know what is going on with this computer, but been trying to fix it. All right, let me go back to my screen here so I can see. maybe. Ugh. Hang on. Okay. All right. Back to where we were. So in Mike's two people, one of them, their home state is in Idaho where they live. They hold an Idaho EMS license, correct? And their address is in Idaho. His other employee lives in Jackson Hole, and they hold a Wyoming EMS license, or let's say that they don't hold any EMS license, okay? That person has residency in Wyoming, which means they don't fit underneath this compact. They don't have a license in a compact state and are trying to work for an EMS agency, this little clause here. They're not trying to work for an EMS agency that's authorized in a remote state because that employee lives in Wyoming, and that's where that EMS agency is authorized. Now, if Mike holds a license in Idaho to pick up patients, at the next hospital up, then that Wyoming resident would certainly qualify under replica to get an Idaho license, right? Because he's doing business in an agency that is authorized to work in Idaho, and he doesn't hold an Idaho license. And that's a really important distinction. This is one of the more common things that we get questioned about. Some people in the past have tried to use it as a way to recover a license because they let one expire that they had in Wyoming, but they hold a valid license in Texas or wherever. That doesn't fly. You have to reside and have a home state license in a state that is not Wyoming. Then, if that home state you hold a license is part of the compact, then you may qualify for replica privileges or compact privileges in our remote state. But if you work for an EMS agency that isn't authorized in the remote state, then all of this is null and void. So where that comes into play is, let's say Driggs, Idaho. Okay. Driggs, Idaho also employs Mike's other guy, right? And that's totally fine. Everything's legit. He's got an Idaho license, all is well. His privilege to practice that he got by going to work part-time for Jackson does not extend to his duties he does with Driggs, Idaho, because Driggs is not an EMS agency that is authorized to practice in Wyoming. Does that make sense? They have no license here, so the EMS agency itself is what's knocking him out from being able to get remote state privileges in Wyoming. And this is super confusing. It's confusing for me. It took me a long time before I could even have the very confusing conversation I'm having with you right now. It is a twisted mess, but the easiest way to think about it is any person who says, I want to get privilege to practice under replica, the very first question is, what is your address? Okay? If their address is in a state that is a replica state, and that state is not Wyoming, then that's the first little checkbox. Okay, this person may be eligible to work here. Then the very next question is, what EMS agency are you going to be working for in Wyoming? If the answer to that is an agency that does not hold a license or other authority to operate in Wyoming, then that is a big red X in that checkbox. They do not qualify under replica. So one of the problems this creates is one of the main reasons why the compact was ever first envisioned, as Scott can tell you because he was part of that world, was to solve this cross-border firefighter EMS work issue. Well, the compact in today's version actually does not solve that very well, except that if Driggs, Idaho wants to come and fight a fire, or be part of a firefighting operation here, this doesn't say they have to have a license. You with me? This says they're an EMS agency that's authorized. So we have other provisions in Wyoming law and rule that allow us to grant authorizations to agencies. It's not so easy with people, but with agencies to come in and do business in the state under the auspices of solving a problem. Okay? Is anybody's brain completely broken yet? I can't see. I'll pull up the chat. But yeah, it's super confusing. Do not feel bad. I want to open this with the system viewer. Well, okay, whatever. We'll leave it here. Here's that banner. All right. So clear as mud, right? The agency has to be authorized, and the person has to not live in Wyoming, and the person has to be coming from a state that is authorized under the EMS Compact in their own state. Okay, that's that. The criminal background check. Notice here it's got what appears to be conflicting language, right? You would think underneath an EMS Compact there would never be a need or a reason or a circumstance where a person has, let me highlight this, has more than one home state in which they are licensed. But that absolutely exists. So the language of this rule means if you, under replica, in order to sign this, in order to sign off on this law in the first place, you have to agree that within 5 years, you're going to be doing fingerprint background checks. So theoretically, by 2023 or two, I don't remember, by the end of one of those 2 years, every state should be on board with this. But there are some states currently, because there was a grace period put in there, that do not do fingerprint background checks. So the way this reads is if, so you've got a licensee who has a license in Idaho and Wyoming, both of those are replica states, compact states, then both of those states has to document in the coordinated database that they can't say that they passed or that there was any bad information in there, but they have to indicate that as, yeah, we did this in order to be qualified under the compact, because any home state has to do it. Does that make sense? So this also creates a pathway where people can have multiple home states. So that will get, at some point, really confusing for the state offices to manage who's coming from where and where they actually are residing to figure out all of this craziness. But you really shouldn't have to worry about that too much. That'll be us. So the next one is you have to have an unrestricted license issued by the home state. This means all home states, right? Because we already said up here, this provision lets there be multiple home states. So if any of your home states has taken any sort of action against you, or potentially any remote state, which is this next piece, then you very well may be disqualified, and you might find people who you're trying to bring into your agency that are disqualified because they've had some sort of action against them, some sort of reduction in ability to practice, either in the state in which they hold a card, or an example, they came over to Wyoming, did something dumb, got in trouble for us, and we restricted them in some way. If we did that, or any other remote state does that, then they've got some hoops to jump through to be able to get that privilege to practice. So we're required under the law that anytime we take an action against anybody who holds a home state license from us, specifically these are the 5 things we have to disclose. If they're an unrestricted, a restricted, suspended, revoked, or denied. Okay. This doesn't mean if you have a written warning from us for something that you did or did not do, that information doesn't go there unless we laid a restriction on it, right? Restrictions aren't super common out of our office, but we do them. An example is someone comes from out of state who holds an EMT license out of state, but they're not necessarily going to be working in Wyoming. They want to come here to go to school, right? If something comes up to where there's a reason why we can't issue them a Wyoming license, we might issue them a restricted EMT license so that, and the restrictions in there are very specific. You may not work in Wyoming. You may not operate as an EMT in Wyoming outside of your pathway through school, right? So we might grant someone an EMT license who's qualified in every respect other than physically working here, maybe because they're not going to physically work here, or they don't want multiple home state licenses to have to deal with. So we might issue them a restricted license, and it would have provisions specifically saying this license is for this purpose, and you may only use it for this purpose, and it ends at a certain time, right? That's an example of restricted. But if someone has that, the reason why this is in here is it has to be reported. So that person couldn't utilize Wyoming as a home state and try to get a privilege to practice somewhere else, right? It would be a restricted license. The rest of them are pretty obvious. What it doesn't say is expired, which is important and is probably what is going to come up a lot more than anything else you see here. But expired is sort of included by default, because if their license is expired, it cannot be unrestricted, if that makes sense. So that's how this compact deals with that. So more stuff, if we take an action against somebody's license, we have to notify the commission. Now that does not mean that you pick up the phone or everybody stands in line at a commission meeting and then rats everybody out. This is what the database does for us. And Scott's going to go through that. But anyway, I don't want you to think that we have to tell, like, physically on the phone every commission member every time we take an action. We do not. That stuff lives within the database, sort of like owls, but think of owls for the entire country. Yeah, so these are the things we have to notify them about. Doesn't really matter to you. You should read that on your own, though, so you know what kind of information we may share about you. This is the process for getting it restored if it's been taken away. All that happens inside of that database. It's nothing that you really have to worry about other than asking us about it if you come up. So this one, if an individual is licensed in a home state that doesn't collect and submit all of the elements of the uniform data set, this is not talking about a patient care report. This is talking about to the database, then that is a blanket ineligibility. So this basically says, Wyoming, you have to do this, state of Wyoming, and if you don't do this the right way, then none of your people get privileged to practice outside of it. That's what that means. So it's an impetus on us. All right, scope of practice. The next most confusing area. So let's go through this. An individual providing patient care in a remote state under a privilege to practice shall function within the scope of practice authorized by his or her home state unless or until modified by the appropriate authority in the remote state. So translate that to English. EMT's scope of practice that they have in Texas comes with them into Wyoming, right? They're not necessarily, we're going to talk about it in a second, but they're not necessarily taking on now a new Wyoming scope of practice. They have the Texas scope of practice, okay? Hold that in your head because we're going to talk about that more. So let's read A. Each member state EMS authority that chooses to modify the scope of practice of individuals who are in the state under a privilege of practice, we must report that to the commission for publication as described in these rules, okay? So in other words, we have the authority to say in Wyoming, Texas EMTs cannot do this thing that they can do in Texas. Does that make sense? The problem is, not necessarily the problem is, the other caveat to that is B. If the statute and rules in the remote state allow further modification of scope of practice, an EMS agency may further modify an individual scope of practice. Okay. And then before I explain that, I'm going to read C. If the EMS authority of the member state in which patient care is provided specifies a scope of practice that the EMS agency must follow, the individual will follow the scope of practice for the EMS agency for which the individual is providing care. Untwist your brain real quick, because I'm about to make this really easy. What this says is that our rules apply. And that's all it says. Okay? Let me explain that. Every EMS agency that has authority to work in Wyoming is who? Everyone who holds a license as an ambulance service or fire protective service or whatever you want to call it. Every agency that holds a license to work in Wyoming is subject to Wyoming EMS rules. We all agree on that. In those rules, as it relates to agencies, we say every EMS agency shall have a physician medical director. Every physician medical director shall create patient care protocols. In other words, define the scope of practice for their agency. Okay? So even though what I just said at the beginning, where a Texas EMT comes in to work in Wyoming, they work under the Texas scope of practice, B and C make that not true in Wyoming, because our rules very specifically say how a person gets from I hold a license to doing a thing. And that is, you have to be licensed to do it, which means an EMT in Wyoming is an EMT in Wyoming. Our scope of practice binds them. So why this particular piece exists in these rules, I am not completely sure, other than the idea, I don't know that this is true, but some states may not get into the specific scope of practice under their EMS authority, right? A good example of this, even though they're not a member state, is Montana. Montana has two different entities at the law enforcing level, right, that deal with EMS. They have their version of the state office of EMS, and they have their board of medicine. Their state office of EMS, and I may mess this up a little bit, but it's okay, I'm just telling a story. Their office of EMS controls the scope of practice for EMTs and EMRs, maybe advanced EMTs. I'm not completely sure, okay? But what they definitely don't control is the scope of practice for paramedics. Alaska is the same way. So this little 4.4 creates a mechanism, right, for the competing authorities. So if we get a licensee from Alaska that comes in, and the paramedic scope of practice in Alaska allows a paramedic to perform dental surgery, okay? Because maybe there's a need for that in Alaska. I don't know. But let's say that they're allowed to do that. If we, this particular remote state, did not address scope of practice and bind it to certain things based on what we call you, then they would bring that with them from Alaska. But because our rules and our law binds levels to what we have bound them to and defined a scope of practice and said that we grant you the license to do these things, but you still have to have permission from your physician medical director or online medical control to do a thing, and you have to be doing that thing underneath an agency that has an authorization to do stuff in Wyoming. It basically means this whole 4.4 for us says anybody you bring in has to follow Wyoming EMS rules as far as scope goes and your physician medical direction process. All that means. It's a lot of words. That's what it means. Trust me on it. I know I'm right. I've ran this through about 6 different attorneys. I am absolutely right on this. People can't come in and just do random weird things that we don't expect in Wyoming. A really good and poignant example of this is Colorado. Colorado paramedics are allowed to do many, many things that that Wyoming paramedics aren't. Not many, many things, but a couple of things, okay? I can't think of any of those off the top of my head, but let's say that's inserting chest tubes, all right? Because Colorado does these waivers, and the waiver doesn't cross state lines, regardless of what anybody says, because a waiver was issued by a doctor who's licensed to practice medicine in Colorado. Unless that doctor is licensed to practice medicine in Wyoming too, their prescriptions don't work here, right? They mean nothing. They don't qualify under law. They have no authority to grant things in Wyoming, so it doesn't move. But let's just say a Colorado paramedic is convinced that it does. They come in with their Colorado scope of practice, but B&C says that if statutes in Wyoming allow modification of the scope of practice by an EMS agency, i.e., your agency has to have protocols and you have to have a physician medical director and all that stuff is in place, unless your physician medical director says, yes, you can put chest tubes in, then they can't. But your physician medical director can't say that because of C. Does that make sense? C says that the state can set a scope of practice, and we did that, so we limited your doctors from being able to grant things that are outside of our scope. Anybody stupid confused yet? I see a question in here. Will remote states require documentation if another compact? So Tony, that can't happen in Wyoming, like we just discussed. I see you put privilege to practice. So yes, and Scott will talk about that in detail, but the EMS agency don't have the authority to bring someone in, right? The state EMS authority up here, right? We are the ones who can grant people privileges. You cannot, okay? So yes, we will know when we have granted privileges to someone, and you are involved in the process of getting those privileges granted for a person. If that doesn't answer your question, put in chat how I messed it up, but that should be the answer. Okay, good. All right. And like I say, I'm sorry. I know this stuff is confusing. That's why we wanted to have this meeting, because I'm sure that as swirly as your brain is right now, I promise you, my brain has been there, and Scott's has too. This is really confusing, but I'm trying to make it as simple as we can. So 4.4, all that matters here is they do not get to do weird things. If you bring an EMT in from a remote, if you bring an EMT in Wyoming to operate under a privilege to practice from whatever other state, their scope of practice is now whatever scope of practice we recognize in Wyoming, which is why we have to be careful what we call people, okay? This comes, but we certainly were not thinking about the compact when we did this, but remember the old way of doing intermediate where you could have I don't remember how many we figured, but there was 30 different versions of it, ultimately that you could have. This is the reason why that had to go away. An intermediate has to be a thing, and everybody who holds an intermediate license has to be that same thing. And it's because an AEMT in either Montana or Utah, I don't remember, one of those two, is different than what we call an advanced EMT. Very different. They're like an intermediate here, okay? And they can have bits and pieces of what we know as an AEMT. When we bring them in, we can't bring them in under their version of AEMT. We have to make sure that when we say you are an advanced EMT in Wyoming, you are a Wyoming advanced EMT for the intents and purposes of what you're doing here. It's a tricky, sticky widget when everybody calls stuff different names and has different things under the same name. So that's one of the reasons why we are trying to control the nomenclature and align ourselves with the way that most of the rest of the country does, is because it will make all of this work better. That was not why we started it. We started it because it was crazy, and I can't believe that it worked as well as it did work. But we were seeing it absolutely not work anymore. So that's why we made those changes, and we'll continue to dial those in to get people moved across the levels for those that are between them. All right. Anyway, so notification, we have to notify, according to this, any changes that are done. We've already notified them, right? Our rules are public. Our rules are out there. We do not have to make specific case-by-case notifications. It is black and white. So notification, this doesn't require a particular thing other than what I have already done with the commission and told them this is what we are following. There is no mechanism for somebody to bring their home scope of practice with them under this. There is only one time in Wyoming law where that can happen, and that is under a declaration, a serious declaration, to where we take all the rules off of licensing. All right, we say, you know what, come in here, help us solve our stuff, do your thing. We don't have any questions for you. Come on, right? In that case, they absolutely can bring their doctor across state lines. They can bring all of that because it has gotten real bad. The pandemic we just went through did not rise to that level, okay? We're talking massive, massive, massive wildfires, and we are out of people. We're talking Yellowstone cooks off. We're talking a massive solar flare fries all the electricity. Things like that would be that level of emergency where we would do this. Basically, if I'm at a point in my daily job life where I can talk to you about what our statutes are, then everything is normal. If we're having a conversation to where I go, I don't know, fix it, all bets are off. All right. And there's provisions in the law to allow that to happen. So as far as I know, that's never actually happened. Chris says, does the compact cover an out-of-state ambulance service licensed in Wyoming operating with the out-of-state licensed employees? And do we need to still license our employees in Wyoming? It depends. That's a great question. So here's how, let me make sure that I've covered the main parts of that. We're going to skip all the adverse action stuff because that doesn't matter for you guys. Scott's going to talk about coordinated database. I think that's, yeah, that's it. They also, this is important to note, they have the authority to do emergency rulemaking, just like we do, and there's some particular provisions for that. So these things can change very, very quickly, so we have to stay on top of it. And these are the reasons why they can do it. These rules were in place when we put the compact live. So it was under this provision right here that we turned replica on early. Does that make sense? They just skipped a couple of steps. So, all right, let's get on Chris's question, because that's the big elephant in the room, right? Chris, what agency do you represent? Let's just be specific. Chris? Okay. Gold Cross Ambulance, Utah. Sorry, I can't remember everybody's name. Howdy from Utah. All right. Does the compact cover an out-of-state ambulance service licensed in Wyoming operating with out-of-state licensed employees, and do we still need to license our employees in Wyoming? So let's hit the rules. Let's do check boxes, because this is the checkbox you need to go through in your head when you think this stuff out. Okay. This says, the state of Wyoming shall recognize, and Utah is completely done, I'm pretty sure, right? I'm 90% sure that Utah is completely done under the compact. There's a couple of states that are in flux, but I don't think Utah is one of them. So let's just assume that they are. They're a full compact state. I believe they are. So a remote state shall recognize the privilege to practice of an individual who is licensed in another member state, provided that the home state complies with Section 3 of this compact. We do. All right. We do the background checks. We do all that stuff. We're good to go. So that's a check yes on A. The individual is performing EMS duties that are assigned by an EMS agency, in this case, Gold Cross Ambulance, that is authorized in Wyoming, right? Gold Cross holds an ambulance business license in Wyoming. So their employees, if they are sent here, certainly are operating, doing EMS duties that are assigned by a licensed EMS agency in Wyoming. So that's a check yes. Hopefully, Utah is doing criminal history background checks, and they're documented by the home states of those licensees. So that's going to be a checkbox. If that individual has an unrestricted license issued by the home state, in this case, Utah, where the EMS agency is practicing in Wyoming, that's a check yes. The individual's privilege to practice has not been restricted or revoked by any member state. We'll assume that, I don't know all their employees, but I'm confident Gold Cross is a well-established and well-oiled company. They wouldn't have people working for them who's had restricted stuff. So that's going to be a checkbox. That's 5 checks, yes. So that means we shall issue a privilege to practice to an agency that's licensed in that other member state. So the answer to your question, Chris, is no. You do not need to still license your employees in Wyoming. However, as Scott's going to get into, that doesn't mean that it's just paperwork free, right? They have to actually be granted a privilege to practice, and that's a paperwork process. So, yes, you are correct, even though you didn't make a statement. But I know what you were getting at, and no, you don't have to keep doing it the way you've always done it. They can operate under their Utah license, with Wyoming being a remote state. They just have to go through the process to get those privileges through the system. So, yeah, absolutely. Does that answer your question, or you got more, Chris? And anybody else? I haven't scrolled through the chat yet. No, it's just all about me not being able to talk. All right, so barring anything else from Chris that I didn't just confuse him. Okay, good. I didn't break his brain completely. Yeah, so last call, if anybody's got anything or wants a point of clarification, and you can also unmute yourself and talk if you want to. Anything? This is your chance before I give it over to Scott.
Hey, Brandon, this is Phil with Alpine EMS.
What's up, Phil?
Hey, got a question. So with us, when we go into Idaho and we have a kind of like a contract with them to go as far as Indian Creek for EMS, is there a paper trail that we need to do with you guys as well, so you guys know that we are going in Idaho sometimes?
No, so on that, the remote state is Idaho.
Okay.
So we would know, like if we wanted to know, like for example, if I looked you up, right, Idaho probably requires, they either require you have an Idaho license or you are doing this under the compact. Which one?
Under the compact.
Okay. Yeah. So we would have access to that. Like if I looked you up in the system, I would see that you have remote state privileges in Idaho, and
Okay.
That's all that matters to us. Yeah. So no, you don't have to do anything. Idaho already has. So when you do, Scott will talk you through this process. I don't want to cut into his time.
Okay.
Scott will talk you through this process, but yeah, when you do the thing, right? Whatever that thing is, when you decide to go into a remote state, that remote state, you apply for recognition under them. They have to reach back to us and make sure that all is well. Now, as the database spins up, that will all happen. Like it won't be a phone call like it was 2 weeks ago. But yeah, you don't have anything to worry about.
Okay.
And so the only other caveat on like the Gold Cross situation is don't forget that address, Chris. If you're, it certainly doesn't apply to you. It would really apply to air medical services. Like say Gold Cross had a helicopter and that helicopter set up a base in Rock Springs. And so you have 10 people who have always been working for Gold Cross, and they work in, they live in Salt Lake or whatever, but they actually moved to Rock Springs to fulfill the duties for that base there. Remember the address, right? They no longer, their home state changes to be Wyoming then. They don't live in Utah and cross the border. They are living in Wyoming and doing work in Wyoming. Replica doesn't apply to them. Does that make sense? So, yeah. All right.
And
so
for you guys with Idaho, and I talked to Derek over there last week, they have a provision that if you're responding from Wyoming, picking up in Idaho, coming back to Wyoming, that you are, I forget what they title it, like a visiting ambulance service. So that's all they truly care about. Now, if you picked up in Idaho and transported into Idaho, then you would have to get an Idaho business license for your ambulance service. But as long as you're coming back to Wyoming, you're okay.
Yeah, every state's different. It would be nice if we did some things uniform, but there's very few things other than we all type in black ink. That's about the only thing we have in common. And that's not even true for Florida, because all of Florida's subheadings are in blue in their rules. So even that's out. But anyway, all right, I'm going to flip it over to Scott. You guys have my email. You got my cell phone number. When you get confused on this, pick up the phone and call one of us, because you're going to. Scott and I, honestly, we still have conversations and we still debate what the language between all of our rules mean. It's okay. It doesn't mean you're dumb. It means that this is super confusing and it's super different, and it's going to be a while before we're all comfortable living in it. So ask questions, do it. You're not going to bug me. You're not going to bug Scott. But if you do want to bug Scott, only call this Replica. Only say those words. So that's it. I'm done. You know how to get in touch with me. If you got questions, ask. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much. I'm muting now.
So, yeah, with that Replica. Okay. So what Brandon would say to just, so everybody's clear of what we're talking about is Replica was a legislation. The compact is the actual thing. Like Brandon said, he pokes that one at me all the time just to mess with me, which I'm good with that. So like Brandon kind of mentioned, we started this whole process back in 2004. It was a group of us from the wildland world, including Dia Gardner, who was at that point the director of EMS for the state of Idaho, and a few other folks from across the Intermountain West. So the things that we're still going to have to drive through, the processes we're still going to have to look at and talk about. Brandon talked about the National Coordinated Database. What that is, it's a database that everybody's information from a compact state feeds into. And then we, as the states within the compact, can go in, look at that information, pull that data down, and also if somebody has a licensing action or a disciplinary action, so that we will also document it into that database, just to keep everybody informed, to talk amongst us as the 23 states that are, part of the system. So there's two ways that you can request recognition under the EMS Compact in Wyoming. One is through the paper form, which is the EMS Compact Information Exchange Form. And what this form is completed by the benefiting agency. So again, using Jackson Hole, there's the example. Chief Moyer or Chief Coe would fill out this document. They would say, I'm hiring Jim Johnson from Idaho. Here's their Idaho number. Here's their their name, their Idaho number, their information, and then they would send that to us here in the office. We would go through, make sure we would verify with Idaho, and then we would be able to document them. Why is this important? Why do we care? Well, we still got to be able to put people into waters. We still have to track folks in house. The rules still say that an ambulance service or EMS service, non-transporting, will keep a updated roster within the system. So if we don't know who's there, you're not keeping up your updated roster. So there is a service you're having some issues that, Brandon could come talk to you about. So you would fill out this document. They would send it over to, like I said, send it over to Idaho. Excuse me. They would verify everybody's unrestricted license, and then they would send that back to us here in Wyoming to make sure that we're able to document these people. The biggest area we used this in so far was last year during the Mullen fire, and just with the number of people that we had to bring in from out of state. Some of the advantages to the Mullen fire, where we were under the pandemic emergency licensing process as well, so we were able to make some things work. But as soon as that governor's declaration ends here soon, hopefully, and we get back to licensing completely as normal, some of that will change. The other way that folks can request recognition under the compact, and this will be the preferred means here going forward, because as of last week, ALS is now hooked to the National Coordinated Data Bank, and we are able to process requests in real time through the system. ALS reaches out to that data bank, pulls that person's information, and returns us a result back that either says, yes, they are unrestricted, no, they are not, they are restricted, do they have a privilege to practice or not? And then that'll be done all automatically through the system. So the only thing we have to look at and pay attention to is there are a couple of the compact states that have not got linked into the database yet. So if they're from that state, then I will then go back and do the hard copy paperwork to get it done. But by doing this, and by doing it through ALS, it cuts down on a couple of those steps. To be able to roster the individuals, they have to be in ALS. So as a service, it behooves you to have any of these individuals that are going to be coming in, going to be connecting with you at that service level, and get them their ALS account built, even if they're not going to grab Wyoming licensure right off, that it allows them to be documented and be documentable for you on your rosters. One of the other projects that we are working on, and we're a good ways into this, is there will be eventually, and you guys know some of the timelines we've put out there in the past, a link between ALS and Waters. So the only way to put a provider into Waters in the future, and we don't have a good timeline on it yet, we're working with Image Trend to make this all happen. The only way to add a provider to Waters will be they have to exist in ALS. This is going to do two things in the long run. If somebody expires, it'll automatically, in their license, it'll automatically lock them out of Waters. And when they call you as the agency administrator, it gives you that hint to look at that and see why. And, can create some opportunities to avoid issues down the road. So, but this again is why we want them to go ahead and create their account in ALS. Just do this compact request form. The compact request form is really simple compared to some of the other things that we do in our system. It's who are you? And then after the who are you, it is what is your home state? These are the states that are currently within the compact, and I'll pull up a map here in a second. So again, Idaho, my home state license number, when it expires, and what level I am. Still want to know that this person has current CPR, has current ACLS, and that all that is in place. So once you do that, you submit it. Be interesting to see what happens here, because not tried this since we hooked up to the database last week. And this was Johnny Test, one of our test dummies. But now this will reach out to the coordinated database. It'll check Johnny's status, and then it will come back and it'll email me, and it'll say, hey, Scott, Johnny Test requested compact status. He's cleared through the national coordinated database, and go in and approve his privilege to practice. So at that point, then we will go in from the Office VMS side and authorize that privilege to practice. And then that'll show up on the individual's account. And we'll have to, this is something I haven't turned on yet, but here on their main page where it has their license number, we'll also see a panel that has, or a line that has compact approved. You'll also be able to look that up through the public portal as well. So you go into the license verification, you'll look it up there. And again, there's just a couple of those things that we still have to get turned on and get all set up now that these things are ready to go. But again, it'll come in. We'll pick on me. And like we have community EMS listed here, we'll also end up with compact status listed here as well. So you as an administrator will be able to go out, look at somebody and see if they've done what they're supposed to have done, see if they've been granted that ability and make that work. Our goal with these, just like the emergency licensing, if necessary, is a 24 to 48 hour turnaround. Would I ask if it's somebody that you have to bring in to do something right now? Is one plan ahead better? No, but also email me, text me, call me, something, let me know that there's, for some reason, we had a sick call at the Rock Springs base. So we're bringing somebody over from Salt Lake to cover that shift. And, we need that person pushed through. And then we can work with you on that. We'll look at it. And, anywhere I have internet access, I can get in and look at that. So, those are the two different ways that we're going to bring people in. If you want the EMS Compact form, so you have that in your, your box there, let me know. I'll forward that out to you. I can drop that in email without a problem for you. So the other part, Brandon talked about the coordinated data bank. Right now, out of the 23 states, just right around half are linked into that. When that is complete, every state that's in the compact will go through, get linked into that database. We will be able to research anybody in any of the states. So if for some reason we put somebody in, can't find them, we can go directly into the database from our side, from the administrators, and look at that. And then we can see, does that person have a restriction on their license in Colorado, Alabama, wherever that might be. And then we're able to work through that process, work through this stuff that's going on, and get these people taken care of. So talking about the compact, here are the states, Brandon mentioned this earlier. For us, like we said, everybody around us, except for Montana, is playing. South Dakota has their legislation through. They're just waiting for their legislation, their rules to go into effect. And it's either July 1st or January 1st. I haven't looked at their stuff recently to see where they're at. Louisiana is the same way. That's the other state that's coming in to the system. That's not quite in yet. So this is where we are, kind of what we've got going on at this point. The thing to remember, and like Brenda said, that the requirements to be part of the compact is the state, like I said, has to have a disciplinary action process in place, including how they do investigations. They have to have a biometric background check, so fingerprint-based background check into place. And also, they have to use National Registry as their cognitive testing module for the nationally recognized levels. So EMT, AEMT, paramedic. That's one of the reasons why a few years ago, we switched over to using National Registry for those levels. So those are the items that a state has to put into play. The initial, when this first kicked off, was a state, if they weren't doing fingerprints, had 5 years to bring their people or bring their biometric background check process online. And I think that has changed, and Brandon, you may know better. I think it's down to 3 now. If not, it's a requirement. We've been doing it for 11 years now, so we had no problem from the Wyoming side of keying into that. So it's kind of the basics of it. Any other questions, thoughts? Yeah. Do we expect there to be some, hiccups and some things down the road? Yes. One of the things that every state does have the right to do is they have the ability to go in and create their own rules within their state that may be more restrictive than the rules of the compact. So just because we accept the compact the way we do in Wyoming doesn't mean Colorado is going to accept that, or that Utah or Texas or Alabama or whoever that is. So if you are going to go from Wyoming and go out to another state and operate under the compact, just be aware that there may be some differences in the other states. Some people initially describe this as like having a driver's license. It's not exactly the same, but the one thing that is the same as the driver's license compact is that you are held accountable by the rules of the state that you are operating within. So bring somebody in. The biggest one, the chest tube issue that we ran into was we had a paramedic come in from Colorado, started a chest tube in Wyoming. It's not allowed here. So, we had to go and deal with that. EMTs coming up from Colorado can do a lot of things, but can't necessarily do those in Wyoming. So we just got to, people have to be careful and make sure that they know what the rules of the service is that they're working with when they're in that remote state. So, and that's why that service part of things is in there. And that's why it's important to have that service connection so that, you can get in there and get it going. So we did record the meeting today. It'll take a while for it to render and be ready. The goal will probably be the first part of next week to have it up and available. Obviously, with it being a holiday weekend, it's going to take a little bit longer than normal. But just know that that's there, and it'll be coming. So again, like I said, here's the states. Also on the compact website, if you go to the resources, and actually the easiest way, so if you go to under the committee, go to rules, documents, and bylaws. This is Brandon was mentioning, and I threw the documents in there, the public comment on proposed rules, the current rules, commission meetings. Commission meetings are open to the public. So you can get on their mailing list to get notified of those. The executive committee meetings are closed just to the executive committee, so that their minutes and everything will be here. And you can see there's a few of those. The rules committee and any policies are all available as you look through and go through that. So again, like I said, the minutes are all there. The proposed rules and the current rules are all available. So again, you want to go in, take a look at any of that, jump in there and grab it, and it'll be available to you. other questions, other comments, thoughts, fears?
Scott, did you see Ian's question?
I did.
Okay.
Yep. Perfect. Well,
wow, we explained it so good that nobody has any questions.
Either that or we confused them so much that they don't know what to ask.
How many of you are asleep? Raise your hand.
So yeah, like Brandon said, he and I will stand in the hallway and we'll have discussions about this. And sometimes it's like, okay, how did there's still some interpretation, but we're coming together on that and making sure we have it all down. I will be putting out a couple of guidance documents for bringing people in, one of which I'm stealing from our inferior rectangle state below us. This is going to give everybody an overview of, what are the different steps that somebody can come in and get a privilege to practice or a license to practice in Wyoming. So keep an eye out for that. Should be done within the next, again, another item within the next week or so. And it'll give us some guidance, some insight, and some little bit of clarity to who needs to get what, when, and how, and just work through that process. One of the things too, if you're bringing folks in from out of state and you're getting them their Wyoming license and they're going through the conditional licensing process, make sure they're actually reading the first question on the conditional affidavit and doing their thing right. I've had 2 people this month that have sent me a conditional affidavit. They've got their conditional license. And then a week later, they call me and say, hey, how do I get fingerprints done? And so then my question back to them is, why did you lie on your application? So remember, the first question on that conditional affidavit is, I have submitted my fingerprints to DCI. So again, if you're bringing people in, just kind of help them through that process. Both of those were very simple misunderstandings that got fixed, but they're falsifying a notarized document and lying on an application, so it could actually set them up for a reason for revocation. But we're not that mean all the time. So cool. If you have any other questions, like Brandon said, reach out to us. Let us know. We'll be more than happy to help clarify, or be more than happy for the 2 of us to sit down together and bang our heads together for a minute and make sure that we're giving you the right answers. So, but otherwise, that's what I have. If nobody else has any other questions.
Hey, thank y'all for coming.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. And like I said, as soon as I'm able, I will get an email sent out with the link to the recording and make it available for all those who didn't have the opportunity to hang out with us today.
All right, y'all be safe out there. Brandon's out.